October 1944. A Wehrmacht intelligence officer sits in a concrete bunker somewhere in occupied Holland, reading a report for the third time, and it still doesn't make sense. The numbers are wrong, not in the way battlefield numbers are sometimes wrong, off by a clerical error or a miscommunication in the chain, but wrong in the way numbers are wrong when something happened that doesn't fit any category in the manual. The report covers the fighting along the Scheldt Estuary, the flooded polder country on the border between Belgium and the Netherlands, the flattest and most open killing ground on the entire Western Front. The German 64th Infantry Division had been dug in there for weeks, behind concrete bunkers and flooded fields, with dike roads pre-registered for artillery and machine gun positions commanding clear fields of fire across open ground stretching hundreds of meters in every direction. The 64th was not an ordinary division. The Canadian First Army itself would later call it the best infantry division they ever faced, manned by experienced soldiers holding well-fortified positions on terrain that every military calculation said was uncrossable without catastrophic losses. The Canadians had crossed it anyway, appearing inside German positions from directions that should have been impossible, moving through ground so flat and exposed that the defenders themselves had described it as ground where no one can move without being spotted. Then there was the casualty ratio. German losses: 12,707 men killed, wounded, or captured. Canadian losses: 2,077. 6-1, in terrain deliberately flooded and fortified to make those numbers impossible. The officer sets the report down, picks up his pen, and writes the same question German officers had been asking since Normandy: how are they doing this? The answer wasn't in any intelligence file he had access to, or in any tactical manual the German army had produced. It wasn't in Europe at all. It was in the forests of British Columbia, the prairies of Saskatchewan, the subarctic bush of northern Ontario, and in the decision one Canadian general made when everyone else looked at that flooded landscape and called it impossible. This is that story. To understand what the Wehrmacht officer was looking at, you have to understand the ground itself, because the ground is the whole story. A polder is land reclaimed from the sea, diked, drained, and held below sea level by a network of channels and pumping stations. The Scheldt Estuary was polder country. Stand on one of the dikes that cross the region and look out. Flat ground stretching to the horizon in every direction, no hills, no ridges, nothing but an occasional line of willows along a canal. The roads ran along the tops of the dikes, 4 or 5 meters above the surrounding fields, which meant the Germans dug in along them looked down on everything below the way spectators look down from stadium seats. A man standing upright could be seen at 2 kilometers. A man crawling could be seen at 500 meters. The drainage ditches crisscrossing the fields were knee-deep and full of freezing October water, and every road, dike, and canal bank had been pre-registered for German machine gun and mortar fire months before the Canadians arrived. That was the ground. And the men about to cross it had not been ordinary soldiers for a very long time before the war started. September 1939, Canada enters the war. 11 million people spread across the second largest landmass on Earth, most of it empty, not the way a rural English county is empty but the way wilderness is empty. Boreal forest that swallowed sound, prairie grassland where the horizon bent, tundra that ran on until the Arctic Ocean. The men who volunteered came from those places, not as visitors but as people who had lived inside them. A wheat farmer from Saskatchewan had spent every autumn of his life reading land, watching how wind moved through grass, knowing which folds in the ground could hide a man from sight, understanding that the difference between visible and invisible was sometimes 6 inches of elevation. He didn't call this fieldcraft. He called it walking to the barn. A trapper from northern Ontario had spent winters alone in boreal forest where survival depended on moving quietly enough not to spook a marten at 40 paces. He knew how to place his feet on frozen ground without snapping a branch, and that a man moving slowly against a tree line is invisible while a man moving quickly across open snow is visible for a mile. No manual taught him this. He'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it from his. Among these volunteers, in numbers exceeding every other demographic group in the country, were Indigenous men: Cree, Ojibwe, Blackfoot, Mohawk, Métis, Inuit from communities where hunting and tracking and reading the land were not hobbies but survival. A commanding officer wrote a phrase during the war that should appear in every history book written since. He called them snipers from birth. It wasn't a metaphor. By 1944, the Canadian Army had made a decision no other Allied force matched. Every infantry battalion would have a dedicated scout and sniper platoon, not a group of good shots pulled from the ranks when needed, but a permanent, trained, equipped unit operating in two-man teams with specific tactical missions. Men were selected for backgrounds no training course could replicate, and in a Canadian battalion those backgrounds were not hard to find. Now put those men in front of a flooded polder in October 1944 and give them a mission. What the Germans saw next is what their intelligence officer was still trying to explain 3 weeks later. October 6, 1944. Lieutenant General Guy Simons had a problem. The Breskens Pocket, a fortified German position on the south bank of the Scheldt, 10 kilometers deep, surrounded by the North Sea, the Scheldt Estuary, the Brakeman Inlet, and the Leopold Canal. The Germans had deliberately flooded most of it, which meant the few raised dike roads were the only approaches available to an attacking force, and the Germans had every one of those roads pre-registered, pre-targeted, and pre-fortified. A frontal assault along those roads wasn't an attack, it was a cue for the machine guns. Simons studied his maps and saw something the Germans had missed. They had flooded the polders to stop wheeled vehicles and tanks, to channel infantry onto the dike roads where it could be destroyed efficiently. What they hadn't accounted for was a vehicle that didn't need roads. Simons had buffaloes, tracked amphibious landing vehicles, each capable of carrying 30 men through mud flats, flooded fields, and water up to a meter deep. His plan had two parts. First, the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade would assault directly across the Leopold Canal, the kind of frontal attack the Germans expected, the kind that would draw every reserve and gun toward the canal. Second, while the 7th Brigade fought in front of those guns, Brigadier John Rockingham's 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade would load into buffaloes in the dark and sail around the back of the entire German position, landing on the undefended north coast, behind Eberting's lines, inside the pocket. The Germans had spent weeks preparing for a frontal assault and were completely unprepared for Canadians appearing behind them from the sea. On the night of October 9th, the buffaloes moved. Simons specifically forbade any preliminary bombardment. He wanted the Germans looking at the Leopold Canal, not the north coast. The night was dark, the water was cold, and the men sat in the buffaloes with their rifles and packs and wet boots, moving through the darkness toward a coast the enemy believed was safe. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders landed and found 9 sleeping German soldiers in a dugout. The Germans who had called this ground uncrossable hadn't posted adequate sentries on their own back door, because nobody was supposed to come from there. The North Nova Scotians woke them up and took them prisoner without firing a shot. The German situation report for October 10th arrived at Wehrmacht intelligence that day. It read that the enemy had launched a decision-seeking attack on the Breskens bridgehead, that while maintaining strong pressure against the southern front of the 64th Division, he had landed 4 to 5 battalions and some tanks on the northwestern tip, establishing a new bridgehead 3 kilometers deep and 6 kilometers wide, and that the situation was still tense. The situation is still tense. That was the Wehrmacht's way of saying, we didn't see it coming, we don't understand how they got there, and we don't know how to stop them. In any other army, what happened next would have been a military operation, organized and directed, following the plan. In the Canadian sector of the Scheldt it became something else entirely. Leo Major was 23, a scout with Le Regiment de la Chaudière, who had landed on Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. By the time he reached the Scheldt 4 months later, he was fighting with one eye. A white phosphorus grenade thrown by a dying SS soldier on Juno Beach had taken his left eye in the first days after the landing. The medic recommended evacuation to England. Major refused. I can still shoot, he said, and went back to the line wearing an eye patch. During the Scheldt fighting, Major was sent on a reconnaissance patrol alone, after a Canadian company had gone out and not come back. He moved through the dikes and narrow canals in the dark the way a man moves who has learned that darkness isn't a problem, it's cover. He found the company's abandoned equipment, understood what had happened, and slipped into a small farmhouse to get out of the October rain. Through the window he saw 2 German soldiers walking along a nearby dike. He didn't radio for backup. He stepped outside, captured the first soldier silently, then used him as bait, positioning him where the second man would see him. When that soldier reached for his weapon, Major shot him. 1 prisoner, 1 dead German, 1 Canadian, 1 eye. He marched his prisoner to the local German command post, walked in as if he belonged there, and demanded the commanding officer's surrender. What followed is documented and verified by military historians, though it still sounds invented. Leo Major moved through that German position with such aggressive speed and total psychological dominance, never letting any group of Germans organize or understand how many men were attacking them, that he walked out with 93 German prisoners. By himself. When SS troops from a nearby position opened fire, killing 7 of the prisoners, Major didn't stop. He flagged down a Canadian Sherman tank, directed its fire onto the SS position, silenced it, and kept moving. His commanders recommended him for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Major refused it, because Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery would be presenting the decoration, and Major had strong opinions about Montgomery's decision to prioritize Operation Market Garden over the Scheldt while Canadian soldiers bled in the polders. He expressed those opinions to his superiors in language this narration will not reproduce. His superiors put the medal away and let him get on with his one-man war, because that's what you do with a man like that. You get out of his way. October 13, 1944. The 1st Battalion, Black Watch of Canada. Companies B and C stepped off at dawn into 1,000 yards of open Dutch polder, flat as a table in every direction, aiming for a railway embankment at the northern end. They never reached it. German artillery, mortars, and machine guns from the dike tops opened up on ground. The defenders looked down on the way men look down at something they cannot miss. Companies B and C were pinned in the mud, and Companies A and D were ordered to repeat the attack over the same ground against the same guns, with the same result. The soldiers called it the coffin, and the name needed no explanation. But here is what the Germans on those dike tops were watching between the disasters, in the intervals, during the pauses. Canadian scout teams moving across that same ground, not rushing or sprinting between cover points but moving slowly, using features of terrain the German observers couldn't identify from their elevated positions because those features were invisible from above. A drainage furrow 4 inches deep running diagonally across a field. The shadow cast by a line of withered beet tops. A slight rise where 2 fields met, 3 inches of elevation change, enough to break a man's silhouette if he pressed himself into the mud on its far side. The Germans would watch a Canadian scout section enter the near edge of a field and lose them, not see them take cover or go to ground, but lose them, as if the men had become part of the earth. Multiple German after-action reports from the South Beveland fighting used the same 3 words. We're saying nix. We see nothing. One of the most important photographs taken during the entire Scheldt campaign was shot on October 6, 1944, near Capellen, Belgium, by war photographer Ken Bell. It shows 2 men, Sergeant Harold Marshall of the Calgary Highlanders Scout and Sniper Platoon, and his partner Corporal Stephen Cormendy, both in full camouflage, face veils on, rifles wrapped in scrim netting. Marshall is looking directly at the camera, and his expression is not what you'd expect from a man photographed during one of the bloodiest battles Canada ever fought. No tension, no visible stress, just the steady, patient look of a man doing something that felt entirely natural. For Marshall it was natural. He had grown up in the Alberta foothills, learning to read ground and use shadow and microterrain the way a city man uses a sidewalk, before he could drive a car. The German sniper trying to kill him had been trained to do his job. Marshall had been built by a country to do his. The Calgary Highlanders Scout and Sniper Platoon compiled what military historians would later describe as one of the most remarkable records in the history of precision combat. 101 confirmed enemy kills, 1 platoon of roughly 30 men, in 5 weeks, on ground the German defenders themselves had said no one could move through without being spotted. General Kurt Eberding commanded the German 64th Infantry Division in the Breskens Pocket. His division had been assembled from experienced soldiers on leave from the Eastern Front, Italy, and Norway, not green recruits. He had fortified the pocket methodically, flooded the fields, pre-registered every approach, and told his men to fight to the death, threatening deserters with execution. He watched the Canadians take it apart piece by piece over 4 weeks of the bitterest fighting in the Northwest European campaign. By the time the pocket collapsed, his division had taken 12,707 casualties against 2,077 Canadian casualties, 6-1, in defense, in fortified positions. On November 2, 1944, General Eberding surrendered to the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, not in a command bunker or at a formal ceremony but in a pillbox on a golf course, his leather suitcase neatly packed and ready to go. After the war, he was asked about the Canadians. He said they fought with a patient aggression he hadn't encountered before, not reckless or desperate but patient, as if they had all the time in the world and simply intended to use it more efficiently than he did. Then he said the thing Wehrmacht intelligence had been circling around for months without being able to say directly, that the Canadians moved through his terrain as if they had been born to it, not trained. He was right. He just didn't understand why. Here is what the Wehrmacht intelligence officer was actually describing in that report. The German army of 1944 was by any objective measure one of the finest military institutions in history, its officer corps rigorously trained, its tactical doctrine sophisticated, its understanding of terrain and defensive warfare refined through 5 years of combat on multiple fronts. German officers knew how men moved in war, how to predict it, counter it, and kill men crossing open ground. That expertise was precisely the problem, because the German framework for understanding infantry movement was European, built on European terrain, European distances, and European assumptions about what a soldier could see and use. In that framework, concealment meant identifiable cover, a wall, a hedgerow, a building, a ditch deep enough to hide a man's profile. Open ground meant ground without these features, and ground without these features was, by definition, ground where a defender could see everything that moved. That framework was correct for European soldiers. It was completely wrong for Canadians, because the men crossing those polders weren't reading terrain at the same resolution as their German opponents. They were reading it at a resolution the Germans didn't know existed. A German observer on a dike above the Scheldt polders looked out and saw flat, empty, featureless ground with no cover. A Canadian scout from northern Ontario, lying at the base of that same dike, saw something entirely different. A drainage furrow 4 inches deep running diagonally across the field for 60 meters. A slight rise where 2 fields met with 3 inches of elevation change enough to break his silhouette if he pressed his body into the mud on its far side. Grass along a flooded ditch tall enough, by 2 inches, to hide the crown of a man's head if he kept his face in the water. He saw a route. The German couldn't see that route, not because he was incompetent but because his eyes had never learned to read ground at that resolution. He had grown up in a country where terrain features were measured in meters, not inches, trained to identify cover visible from a distance. Nobody had ever taught him, because nobody in his world had ever needed to, that a 6-inch depression in a muddy field could be the difference between a visible target and an invisible man. The Germans were looking for a technique, a camouflage method, a doctrine, a piece of equipment. There was nothing to find. The Canadians weren't using a technique. They were using a perceptual ability that cannot be written into a manual any more than you can write a manual for seeing in color if your reader has only ever seen in black and white. Here is the difference between a trained soldier and a country-built one. A trained soldier learns to use terrain, a country-built one owns it. The German military could build the finest sniper school in the world and produce excellent marksmen in 12 weeks. What it couldn't do in 12 weeks, or 12 years, was give those marksmen the 30 years of daily practice a Saskatchewan wheat farmer had before he ever picked up a rifle in anger. You cannot manufacture that, counter it with doctrine, or write a regulation that fills the gap between a man who was taught to read ground and a man who grew up reading it the way other people read faces. What the Wehrmacht intelligence officer's report was measuring wasn't a tactical advantage. It was a perceptual one, and a perceptual advantage built over generations doesn't appear in any intelligence file. It doesn't show up until the numbers come back wrong, 6-1, in defense, in fortified positions, on the most difficult battlefield of the Western European campaign. That number isn't a statistic. It's the written record of what happens when you send trained soldiers to fight men who were built by their country before the army ever got hold of them. The Battle of the Scheldt ended on November 8, 1944. The 1st Canadian Army had cleared both banks of the estuary, the mines were swept, and the first Allied convoy reached Antwerp on November 28. 2.5 million tons of supplies flowed through that port between November 1944 and April 1945, supplies that sustained the final push into Germany and made the end of the war possible on the timeline it happened. None of it happens without the Scheldt, and none of the Scheldt happens without the men who crossed that ground. 6,367 Canadians were killed, wounded, or went missing in 5 weeks, on a battlefield so awful that veterans who had fought in Normandy, Italy, and Sicily said the Scheldt was worse than any of it. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Black Watch, the Calgary Highlanders, the North Nova Scotias, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, the Regiment de la Chaudière, not famous names outside Canada, but in the drainage ditches and on the dike roads of the Belgian-Dutch polder country in October and November 1944, these men did something that changed the timeline of the war. On terrain, every military calculation said was impossible. One Canadian battalion war diary recorded conditions in words that deserve to be read aloud, that matches and cigarettes were wet and unusable, so the soldier shakes his head, cleans his rifle, swears a good deal, and dreams of what he'll do when he gets leave. Men lying in freezing water in a polder the German defenders described as ground where no one could move without being spotted, moving, invisible, winning, and dreaming of leave. General Eberding was taken to a Canadian interrogation facility after his capture on the golf course and answered questions with the composure of a professional soldier who had done what he could and lost anyway. When asked about the Canadians, he paused, then said they had a quality his officers could describe but not explain, a relationship with the ground that was different from anything he'd encountered on the Eastern Front, in Africa, or against any other Allied formation. Soldiers, he said, were trained to use terrain. The Canadians seemed to own it. The Canadian First Army's own after-action assessment of the Breskens pocket fighting described Eberding's 64th Infantry Division as the best infantry division the Canadian First Army ever met. The victors calling the defeated the best they ever faced, and still winning 6-1 in the defeated's own fortress. Sergeant Harold Marshall came home to Calgary after the war and didn't talk about the Scheldt or the Scout platoon. He took up curling, raised a family, and carried whatever he carried in the silence his generation chose for things like that. He died on January 18, 2013, at 94 years old. 101 confirmed kills in 5 weeks, and almost no one outside regimental historians knew his name. Leo Major came home and went to work as a plumber, then volunteered again for Korea in 1950, led 18 scouts in a midnight assault, and captured a hill from the Chinese army, holding it for 3 days against counterattacks with 18 men. He was awarded a second Distinguished Conduct Medal, and this time he accepted it. He died in Montreal on October 12, 2008, at 87. The city of Zwolle in the Netherlands still honors him every year. In 2018, Dutch soccer fans at an FC Zwolle game unfurled a banner declaring him the sole savior of Zwolle, 73 years after the night he walked into their city alone and drove out 1,000 Germans by himself. The Dutch remember, as they remember everything the Canadians did in that country. Every year Dutch schoolchildren are assigned a specific Canadian soldier buried in one of the war cemeteries, research his name, his regiment, where he came from in Canada, and place flowers on his headstone. Not once. Every year. The same grave tended by successive generations who never met the man beneath it and never will, because that's what happens when you cross impossible ground for someone, when you lie down in freezing water in October darkness so people you've never met can be free. They don't forget. Not in 70 years. Not in 80. Not ever. If someone in your family served in this campaign, if your grandfather was in the Scheldt, at the Leopold Canal, in the Breskens pocket, if your father came home from those polders and never talked about it, put his name in the comments. His regiment where he served. The men who crossed that ground were not extraordinary in the way war movies describe extraordinary. They were ordinary men from ordinary places who happened to have grown up in a country so vast and so wild that it had taught them, without knowing it was teaching them anything, how to become part of the earth they moved through. They took that knowledge across an ocean, lay down in freezing mud in a Belgian polder in October 1944, and became invisible. And they won. The Wehrmacht intelligence officer who filed that report never got his answer, because the answer wasn't in any document. It was in a fence post in Saskatchewan, a frozen lake in Ontario, a trap line in the BC interior. It was in every father who taught his son to read the land before he could read a book. And it was in those sons, lying in the mud, invisible, crossing the uncrossable, because that's what you do when you come from a country that taught you the ground is never as empty as it looks.